Welcome to the annual Queen's University Belfast Equality and Diversity Lecture 2020. You're all very welcome. If we have not yet had the opportunity to meet, I'm Karen McCluskey, one of the professors in the School of Medicine, Dentistry and Biomedical Sciences, and I'm Director of the Queen's Gender Initiative. This lecture was established in 2018 when Conor McGinn, MP, gave the inaugural lecture to a packed live audience in Queen's. As has become the way we do things in 2020, the lecture today is in a live online format. We have a fantastic audience connected via Zoom. There will be opportunity for you to submit questions throughout the talk using the chat box, and we will address as many of these questions as possible during the question and answer session at the end. I would like to thank the Public Engagement Team and the Chief Executives Club in Queen's for organising today's event. Thank you also to Rachel Roberts, who will be signing during the event for us, and thanks to Revolution Productions for looking after all of the technical aspects. Equality, diversity and inclusion is embedded in Queen's. The university places great importance on engendering a culture where everyone is included, all voices are valued and contributions are recognised. The principle of equality is enshrined in the university's Charter of 1908. Earlier this year, the university's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion policy was launched. Policies are important. However, it is practices that impact individuals as we work and study here. The impact of our EDI work is recognised externally through professional bodies and sector-specific charters. These include the Athena Swan Charter for Gender Equality, where the university holds a Silver Institution Award, and our schools hold 3 gold, 7 silver and 6 bronze awards. The Queen's Gender Initiative, a female-focused entity in the university, is celebrating 20 years of supporting the participation and progression of women in Queen's. Work initiated by visionary women to address gender inequality brought about family-friendly policies, childcare on campus and flexible working that's available to everyone, supporting work and life, health and our well-being. The university is proud to be a member of the Race Equality Charter and is utilising this framework to identify and to critically reflect on institutional and cultural barriers standing in the way of Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff and students. The work and the impact of the iRise and PRISM networks supporting Black, Asian, minority ethnic and international staff and LGBT plus staff have been recognised through the Northern Ireland Equality and Diversity Gala Awards. Our Disability Research Network is a multidisciplinary initiative aimed at enhancing collaboration between disabled people, academics, policymakers, practitioners and the community and voluntary sector organisations with an interest in co-produced disability research. Today we are absolutely delighted to welcome Sinéad Burke to give the annual Queen's University Belfast Equality and Diversity Lecture. Sinead Burke is an educator, writer and a disability advocate. These descriptors tell us only a little of Sinead's impact and influence in Ireland and internationally. Her TED Talk, Why Design Should Include Everyone, has amassed 1 million views and is highly recommended to everyone if you're not already one of the 1 million viewers to date. Sinead works towards accelerating systemic change within education and design by focusing on accessibility as a vehicle for creativity, innovation and social justice. She has addressed the World Economic Forum at Davos and is a member of the forum's Future Cities Council. Closer to home, Sinead is responsible for the introduction of the term for little people into the Irish language. She is also passionate about fashion and is the first little person to feature on the cover of Vogue and to attend the Met Gala. Sinead is passionate about utilising her experiences of being the first as a case study to make these practices the rule. Sinead and I had a walk together during lockdown earlier this year. We did, of course, observe appropriate social distancing. In fact, we didn't meet at all in person. But after listening to her BBC Radio 4 Desert Island Discs podcast while I was out walking, I felt that I knew her. I decided during that walk that we needed to invite Sinead to Queen's And it turns out that colleagues in the EDI teams and the Chief Executives Club all had the same idea. It's therefore a great pleasure on behalf of all of us to welcome Sinead to Queen's, albeit virtually on this occasion. Sinead, we invite you to give the 2020 Annual Equality and Diversity Lecture entitled Tilting the Lens, A New Perspective. Thank you.
Karen, thank you so much for that warm introduction that I feel was overly kind and terribly unfair in its just sheer generosity. Thank you. It is a real honor and a joy to be joining you today, and I feel both humbled and not so deserving of this incredible moment, but nonetheless will do my utmost to take up space and to share some of my experiences and my perspective on the world in thinking about disability, accessibility, and how that connects with the work surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion now, in this particular moment. I think in a setting like this, it's important to reflect on where we have come from as individuals and as collectives, and the progress that we have made. The timeline for disability inclusion has not been linear, and it differs by jurisdiction and sometimes even by school, university, household, and community. But for many of us, the medical model of disability is within our lived experience, meaning that disabled people were once classified by their medical condition, and they were spoken about, never spoken with or to. This framing of disability led to the perception that disability was a burden on individuals, families, communities, and society. When someone was born disabled, sympathy was whispered. Disabled people were taken from their homes and communities and placed in care homes and institutions. It's better for them and their families, we said. But did we ever ask disabled people what they wanted? With disabled people placed in the verges of our communities, and with growing economies and democracies, we began to build and design our world. Blueprints for cities and societies emerged without ever considering the needs or accommodations or voices of disabled people. Thankfully, our thinking gradually began to change, but it was slow. The inclusion of disabled people became a conscious decision, but our methodology was through charity. Charitable organizations populated the landscape, and governments abdicated their responsibility and large amounts of funding to this sector. In the beginning, it was functional, but positioning disability within charity makes our act of inclusion one rooted in generosity rather than equity and rights. It cultivated a system wherein charities representing disabled people felt limited in their ability to lobby government and institutions to create change. There was fear that it might risk their funding. And with so many other charities in existence, those funds could be easily allocated elsewhere. The system once again spoke for disabled people, and it created apathy and little progress. In many countries, this cycle continues to exist today. Today, though we aspire to position disability within a disability rights or disability justice model, many countries have signed the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, legislation that guarantees a disabled person's right to dignity, to education, and to participation in the decision-making process, particularly in issues concerning them. However, not all countries, including Ireland even, has ratified the optional protocol, which gives disabled people a voice to challenge those in power when their agency is hindered. Still, even today, so many disabled people are silenced. But before going any further, I should introduce myself, visually and linguistically. My name is Sinéad Burke. I am an Irish educator and a disabled woman. I have achondroplasia, the most common form of dwarfism. I sit across from you today wearing a very loud and bright floral shirt. The loudness and brightness I hadn't previously calculated. It is largely black with pink flowers with green centers and blue details surrounding. I'm a white woman. I am straight. I'm cisgendered, and I have brown eyes and brown hair. Hair that is usually cropped at my chin, but thanks to the pandemic is cascading down my shoulders. I'm sitting in front of a glamorous background that may or may not be my own, thanks to the magic of the virtual domain. But as I said, I have the most common form of dwarfism. So you may be able to tell visually that I'm a little person, whether that be due to my nose and my forehead, characteristics particularly defined by my condition. But sitting, you may not know. I use the vocabulary of little person to describe myself. I am incredibly proud to be disabled and to identify with that global community. My disability is one of my identities that defines me, that shapes my expertise and my interests, and really frames my perspective on the world. This became clear to me on the 19th of September 1994. It was the day of my 4th birthday, and I imagine what you're trying to do right now is to calculate how old I am. Don't worry about counting on your fingers, I'm going to help you. I'm 30. But the 19th of September 1994 was also my first day of school. I started school 19 days later than everyone else because, as a disabled child, there were concerns that my physical disability may have an impact on my educational attainment. I was advised to begin school early so that I would have time, if I needed, to repeat a year of the curriculum. I loved school. The classroom was a safe place for me to discover who I was and what I wanted for my future. I have visceral memories of me running to the classroom library, picking up books from the bookcases and flicking through them. Even when I didn't know how to read, I loved the joy and the escapism of the illustrations and running my finger under each line as I imagined what it might say. I understood the power of stories to change the world, even when stories of people who looked like me weren't represented in the books that I read. I am the product of an inclusive education. And if I'm a success, it's because I am a loved child. My parents nurtured and nourished me to believe that anything is possible. And although there was little representation of people who looked like me in positions of power and influence, and even at the top of my classroom, it didn't mean that my ambition should be dependent on that visibility. On my first day of school, I came home and told my parents that I wanted to be a teacher. Even then, I understood that education was a catalyst for change, a vehicle to challenge biases and assumptions, and to promote new thinking about what a more inclusive future might look like. But what are the practical implications of being a teacher when you are 3 feet tall? When I was in university, a colleague sat beside me. She was studying the same course, and she said, "How are you going to do it? How are you going to be a teacher? How will you control the children? Even from the earliest ages, the children are going to be bigger than you," she said. It was rooted in curiosity, but I was alarmed with how she spoke about children. We shouldn't try to control children. We should respect them. I remember my first day as a teacher. I was teaching 4 and 5-year-olds. And that question of what was I going to do? How was I going to control them? How was I going to answer their questions? As you might imagine, it came up in the first 30 seconds of being in the room. A child raised her hand and she said, "Why are you so small?" Which is a really excellent and important question. I said to her, "Why are you so big?" She took a second to think about it. Her brows furrowed a little, and she said, "I don't know. I was just born like this." And I said, "Well, so was I." And she said, "Great. What page are we on?" And I told her page 6 and asked if she could ensure that she would colour inside the lines. So often we have a nervousness and fear of talking about specific topics and themes with children and with young adults because we think it is too far beyond them, they will not understand. But they are people, despite being younger, rooted in a changing society. We don't do them any credit by eliminating such conversations from their ether. And that notion of how would I function in a classroom? I'm not necessarily disabled because I'm a little person, but I'm disabled because of design, because so much is out of my reach and not considered of me and my needs, even in a classroom. Take yourself back to the time when you were in a classroom. Think of the whiteboard, the light switches, the blinds, the art displays. So much not included for me. I remember standing in front of a group of 30, 12-year-old boys in the inner city in Dublin and beginning to think, what would the classroom look like from an equitable experience and lens? I realized that the boys grouped together by colour weren't something that would work because they couldn't see me from where they were standing and I couldn't see them. So I just changed it. I designed my classroom in a U shape and stood at the top, being able to look at everybody at eye level. It transformed the dynamic of the classroom and was a catalyst in the culture. No longer was I the adult being authoritative, looking down on them, literally and metaphorically, but it created a space where they could ask questions where it didn't feel like there was a wrong answer or there was a vehicle for embarrassment in their responses. It created an equitable lens for them and for me. And the inaccessibility that existed within the classroom was easily solved through collaboration and mutual respect. So yes, I couldn't hang up the artwork on the wall. The recommendation from my university at the time was to ask somebody for help, another teacher across the corridor or a stranger. Instead, I asked the boys that I taught. I shared with them that this wasn't something that I could do independently and created a group of curators in my classroom. I remember them looking at the artwork we had done one week and said, Miss Burke, I know you really tried, but this just isn't your skill. But my goodness, Karen, look at the vibrancy. Look, you stayed inside the lines. My gosh, this deserves to be in a museum. And they would hang those better artworks, never mind, up on the wall. That gave them an opportunity to be critical in a constructive way, to provide feedback and to sit in the center of attention and to begin to think about what it meant to display skills of articulation, of public speaking. Rooted in something I couldn't do, created an opportunity for my whole classroom. Lots of people were so focused on what I couldn't do, like that not being able to reach the blackboard. Instead, I taught by using a projector and a PowerPoint presentation, with every subject in a particular file. Now, for any of you who know or have children, I ask you, how long does it take for children to cause chaos when they're not distracted? Well, it's probably the same amount of time it takes to click out of one PowerPoint presentation and to open up into another, subject to subject, which is about 90 seconds. I was conscious of the inaccessibility of my room being a vehicle for trouble to be instigated in the class. So I created a reward system that was rooted in the interests of the boys that I taught. Music. At the end of every lesson, one child would receive a shopping trolley token that they would then get to pick a song of their choice. It began with the boys trying to prove how cool they were to one another. We listened to a lot of Calvin Harris and maybe some rap artists that I was not very familiar with. But as it evolved, one of the boys came to me and said, Miss Burke, do you have Simon and Garfunkel's Sound of Silence? It was a song from before my era. And I said, yeah, how did you know of it? And he said, well, it's a song we listen to all the time at home. It's my dad's favourite. Could we play it? A couple of days later, he was awarded and the song began to play. There was disquiet from the other boys in the class. They began asking questions about what was this nonsense. He stood up and he said, this is my dad's favourite song. It's important to me and it's important to him. It gave permission for the boys to then go home and ask in the evenings, what did you listen to when you were my age? It created community and a bridge between home and school, a divide that is so often missing, particularly in working class and poorer communities. It created a valued skill set of their parents bringing in something from home, all because I couldn't reach the blackboard. But it gave me a perspective into the boys and the children that I taught that I never expected. Everybody thought that as a disabled teacher, that it would be me who would experience the challenges, not that this could be a fulcrum to see the challenges that might exist in the homes and skill sets of the boys that I taught. I remember one boy who would often cause some of the most difficult behavior in the class. He would attend special education classes in the morning and he would come back into my classroom in the afternoon. So much of the material may have been more advanced for him than he was able to do. But instead of articulating that, he used to just cause trouble, as he would. I remember saying to him all the time, concentrate, focus, pay attention. I would create worksheets that were more at his level and give them to him, but it never really worked. I remember learning that in the weekends, his activity was that he would go around St. Stephen's Green, a large park area in the middle of Dublin, on a horse and cart, and he would bring the tourists around. So I sat with him and I said, how does the horse know not to go into the lane of traffic with the cars? He looked at me like I was bananas and he said, well, they wear blinkers. I said, great. Will you do me a favor? Will you place your blinkers on you? Not literal ones. And for just the next 7 or 8 minutes, will you pay attention to this worksheet and see what it is you're able to do? I came back to him 10 minutes later and I said, how was it? He said, easy. Why didn't you just say? I realized that as an adult, I had been using all of this language that I assumed he understood. But instead of admitting what he didn't know, it was easier to just misbehave, right? It was a valuable lesson in, even though there is moments that I experience that are different to others, we're all experiencing this world differently. And it's so essential that we have an empathy to that collective understanding and difference and root ourselves in somebody else's shoes for just a moment. There were 2 particular moments in thinking about the children that I taught that I wanted to share with you today, about placing yourself in another person's shoes. One of the most challenging subjects to teach in my classroom was math. The boys, well, they hated long multiplication and long division. They didn't see any sort of value in it. They couldn't understand why it was necessary for outside of school. So I brought in the local takeaway menu and I told them the story of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. And I told them that Snow White and Prince Charming had left to go on a date at the very last moment, in a time when we could and social distancing wasn't so stringent. I said Snow White had left us €60 to buy the food. But because they were 7 men, they were fussy. We had a paleo, a pescatarian, a vegan, complicating the academic task for those who were most able for it. So I sat with the children who really struggled. And I said, let's just work out the chips, the fries. One of the boys said, okay, great. 1 bag is $2.50, 2 bags of $5. Excuse me? Yes. This wouldn't have been a child who would normally be so vocal about an answer that they had. So I wrote it down on the board, 2.50 multiplied by 2, £5. He said, what are you doing? I said, maths. So you just did maths, multiplication. He said, I didn't do maths. I did dinner. And as adults, we may be able to find humor in that example. But he was being really sincere. He didn't see any connection between the skills that he had acquired at home, such as ordering chips for the dinner, and the problem solving that we were doing in school. He was continuously code switching, both in his language, his skills, and his personality in order to fit in with one space and the other. But what is our responsibility as educators to make classrooms safe spaces for children to be themselves and to bridge and build those connections to understand that they are valid just as they are? But like the way I live in a world that is designed for you, so often children and students live in worlds that were designed by academics and educators who maybe don't have that lived experience or that background. My final example that I wanted to share with you from the classroom kind of illuminates it. I was teaching France across every single subject. It was the theme for about a month. And I remember bringing in croissants and pain au chocolat to my students to give them kind of a sensory experience of what that culture might be like. I realized, looking around at them, that many of the students didn't know how to hold a knife or how to cut the croissant or the pain au chocolat. I realized that at home, they probably ate with one piece of cutlery, which is perfectly fine. But in social situations, as they would get older, there would be certain cultural nuances that they might miss out on, or that people might judge them for if they don't have an understanding of how to use a whole set of cutlery. For many of us, we take that learning for granted. So that evening, I went to IKEA. I bought 30 forks, 30 knives, 30 spoons, 30 plates, and 30 glasses. And the next day, taught the boys how to set the table. Now, how do you get 12-year-old boys interested in learning how to set the table? Well, you time them and set it up kind of like Top Gear, where everybody has an individual time of how quickly and how accurately they can set the table. They would all of a sudden be assessing one another and saying, no, your fork is not at the right angle. It must move. Or maybe doing that with the cup or the knife or the spoon. Their homework that night was to go home and set the table. And I have never, ever received feedback like it from parents. And it really made me question, what is the role of the curriculum? What is the role of education? What is the purpose of the work that we do in institutions? To not just think of ourselves and design for ourselves, but to design for all. At the outset of my education, within education, so many people assumed, as I said, that my disability would hinder my ability to be a good teacher. But my disability was the fundamental reason as to why I was a great teacher, if I can say that with any sort of humility. My disability has, heightened my empathy and rehearsed my vulnerability, and it has educated me on the reality that there is so much that I don't know. I remember speaking to a student after them asking me a question about maybe something they assumed I should know. And I said, I don't know the answer to that. He said, what do you mean? You're the teacher. And I said, yeah, but we all have limits to our knowledge. Why don't we look it up together? I think those of us who are in positions of power, be it at the top of a classroom or at the head of an institution or a university, so often feel vulnerability in admitting what it is that we don't know. Being disabled has made me an extroverted introvert, meaning that the visibility of my disability has made me the center of attention, often without my consent. But it has given me comfort and confidence standing at the top of the classroom, being a vehicle for children to begin to understand who they are and the impact that they wish to have on the world. But the way in which my colleague questioned me when I was in university about my ability to be a teacher, that questioning of the capacity of disabled people is inherent in our society. In some countries, there is legislation where disabled people have to prove their capacity to get married or to have sexual relationships. I understand that this legislation is rooted in the protection of individuals that we deem to be vulnerable. But when creating such curriculums, policies, and documentation, we must ask, who is not in the room? How can we ensure that we are not creating policies and making decisions for people, but instead creating these objectives in collaboration, molded and shaped by a person's lived experience? I am nervous speaking to you today, and I'm not sure if you heard a second ago, but my dog teetering in, that was nice of her. But I can only speak of my experience and my expertise and ask you to remember that the disability community is broad and intersectional. Disability can be visible and invisible. It spans from chronic illness, disease, autism to mental illness. It can be inherited, acquired, permanent or temporary. The global disability population is 1 billion people, with many countries stating that 1 in 4 or 5 of their citizens are disabled. That means that most people attending this lecture will have a connection to disability. You will definitely have taught someone disabled, and you may be a colleague to someone who's disabled. I ask you to leverage that understanding and allow a human-centered approach to guide your focus. Plus, it's important to note that disabled people can also be multiply marginalized. By that I mean that they can also experience systemic racism and discrimination because they are queer or LGBTQ, because of their religion, their gender, or their socioeconomic background. Disability isn't a single melody, but a cacophony. It's my first time to speak at Queen's University Belfast, even at a distance, and such I boldly ask you to consider the notion that every issue is a disability issue, be that Brexit, climate change, or even migration. With your specific expertise, I ask for your help and offer my participation in thinking through fundamental changes in how we can engage with disabled people and the legislation, curriculum, programming, and financing that is required to create meaningful opportunities for independent living and learning. Universities must be safe and accessible places for people to be themselves. But where to start? Sometimes knowing where to start is often the most challenging and difficult place. I think we should start with language, because so often not having the words builds an apathy and a nervousness that eliminates even the possibility for conversation. As a little person, I often forget that I'm disabled. It's not until I'm in a public place like a supermarket that I'm reminded, because I will be shopping for something like avocados. A child will be in a trolley with a parent or a guardian, and they will spot me. And they will say, "Look, there's a little woman." For any of you who are parents, I imagine even now you can sense the embarrassment and mortification rise within you. What does the adult do? They first try to distract that child with something else glittering that's on the shelf. But no, the child again says, "No, look, there's a little woman." The adult can't believe that this is happening, that they raised this child with empathy, and how could this moment be happening to them? They don't know what to say. They fear that it's the first time ever it's happened to me, and they don't want to embarrass me further. So in not knowing what to say, they say nothing. And they remove that child from my presence as quickly as possible, right into the next aisle and out of the supermarket. But in not having the language and in not facilitating a conversation, they are telling that child that I am not someone to look at, nor someone to engage with. And there was never a moment in that child's life ever again, in school, in university, in work, in civil society, where we encourage and instigate that conversation, where we reprogram the education that is built out of our own embarrassment. That entire moment could be changed by that parent in that moment saying, "Yeah, that is a little woman. Why don't you say hello?" Not making me and every other disabled person be a public educator of our own lived experience, but there's no harm in saying hello. I'd say hi back. That child would be immediately bored because they're like, "Oh, I thought you were going to be interesting. You're in a floral shirt." But no, you're just like me. But not having the language, it creates and cultivates an apathy. And what is the language? Language doesn't just name our society, it shapes it. It is deeply political because it is deeply personal. Not knowing what to say is fine. Ask questions. Ask what is the language or the terminology that you prefer. There is a growing resurgence in the use of identity-first language, saying disabled people over persons with disabilities. But again, it's personal. Start conversations. If you were attending this lecture today, I already imagine you have some interest or some understanding of this area. Where are your colleagues? Where are your students? Where are the stakeholders that you continuously engage with? How can you encourage them to take on a part of the learning that hopefully you'll bring with you today? I want you to think about, if you are a lecturer, how you engage with your students, particularly in a pandemic where we've all been forced to move to digital technologies in order to facilitate a curriculum and an education. How can you make that more accessible for your students? Have you asked? Have your students felt comfortable or safe in asking you? Do they need an agenda in advance, which will help them plot the sensory requirements that's going to be necessary for them to engage? Is there sign language interpretation available? Or closed captioning? Is there an opportunity for them to not have their cameras off because it is so stimulating in being part of even a Zoom call like this? Thank you for your understanding of that. that they may not then have the capacity to be able to engage with everything else that is happening. We must make these digital spaces accessible, but physical spaces too. Institutions like Queen's are so architecturally magnificent, but as we evolve our university spaces, do they limit the potential inclusion of disabled people? With historic and listed buildings, are we continuing to prioritize architecture over people? Or can new developments and new places and spaces on campus be considered with disabled people in mind? Not just with one accessible stall for a bathroom, for example, but with all accessible stalls. These are questions that we can begin to ask so that we move from a position of not just welcoming diversity, but explicitly inviting diversity, of doing the work to transform the culture before these people get here. But we're already here. We just need to find ways to ensure that they feel equitable and accessible in order to be their best selves here. Even, for example, your recommended reading. How many disabled voices are you including within that space? Or if you're in a position to hire people, are you asking new staff coming in, guest lecturers or permanent lecturers, if they have any accessibility accommodations required, even within the interview process? For me, that's a footstool at a desk. For others, that may be something even more. But if we're not asking those questions, we are unintentionally saying to people, this place isn't for you. We are missing out on a wealth of talent, creativity, and opportunity. The work may seem overwhelming, and there is so much to do, despite the progress that we have made. But I genuinely have hope. The pandemic has shifted our compass and made each of us as individuals and as a collective redefine our value proposition. If there is a positive in the deconstruction and the destruction of this virus, it's that this moment has granted an opportunity to redesign our world. As we think about redesigning places and spaces for social distancing, let us imagine how that might be accessible. Thinking this way will make our towns, cities, and countries a place for everyone. But we can't fall into the trap of describing people as vulnerable or using terminology such as those with underlying conditions, because we are actively erasing their humanity and giving ourselves permission to continue to not include them. It has echoes of the past, one which we have done so much and worked so hard to change. Each of you, be you a lecturer, a member of staff, a student, or just a member of the broader community of Queen's University in Belfast, you have the power to transform the landscape for, with, and by disabled people. I ask you to do this with us, not for. This year, conversations surrounding social justice, equity, and rights have been pushed to the fore. This cannot just be a moment. It's a movement that I invite you to join. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sinead. Thank you for the really excellent lecture and for sharing your personal experiences with so many invaluable insights and challenges to all of us in the meeting today. Our audience have submitted questions in the chat box, and I would encourage you to continue to do so. We do have time scheduled for questions, and just bear with me while I pick these up. So, Sinead, some of the questions coming in. First question we had was asked by a member of the audience saying, Sinead, what does it mean to do good?
Gosh, what a wonderful question. What does it mean to do good? I think it means to work with a purpose. For me, I try to leave spaces and people in a better position than when I first interacted with them. And if that's in thinking about meaningful approaches to access and equity and creativity and innovation. But I think to do good is so individual. I think we are in a moment where there is so much understanding of the work that needs to be done in sustainability, in economy, in racial justice, in rights for the trans and the LGBTQ community, in rights for disability. I think there are so many ways. And I think that notion and the overwhelming desire to do good can feel impossible, because it feels like you need to be the president or the provost of a university in order to do good. But actually doing good can be approaching a stranger and asking if they need or would like help prior to them asking you. It can be realizing that that person might say, yes, please, actually, I really need to reach the bread on the top shelf. Can you please pass it down to me? Or that person might say, no, actually, I'm fine. I can do this myself. And you taking that response, not as a reflection on your capacity to help, but on that person's expertise, on their own lived experience and understanding of their capacity. And I think we can do good in large and meaningful ways and realize that we need such energy in this approach to doing good that change takes time. It can happen overnight, or it can happen in weeks, months, and years, as we see. But it can be signing petitions. It can be challenging professors to have more diverse representation of writers and voices in curriculums. It can be being an ally and stepping in for others. I think there are so many ways to do good that it's not even about just starting, because we're already each doing this. Maybe we just need an acknowledgement to ourselves of the work that this is taking and requiring, but to do it with purpose, it has to be intentional. We have to be deliberate in our approach to doing good, because it's so easy to be not necessarily complacent, because I think so few of us are, but to be taken by the humdrum of the quotidian life and to just sit within the status quo. So I think there are so many ways to do good. Sometimes you just need to be more observant to see what's possible.
Thank you, Sinead. Your advocacy to have little people included in the Irish language is absolutely inspiring. And we have a question from a member of the audience saying, Sinead, have you found your advocacy in teaching has been changed by learning languages other than English?
I think that is such an amazing question. I got to spend a month last year in Paris learning French with the Cultural Centre Londres, and spent a month in the 5e arrondissement in Paris studying French. And what's been really interesting as a disability advocate is learning about the importance of language through different cultures and through different linguistic disciplines. Understanding that in French, the most common usage of disability is handicapé, which in an English-speaking word, we have really tried to move away from handicapped as a terminology that is affiliated and connotated with disability, and understanding that so often when we talk about these social justice issues, we need to take a global cultural response and realize that we can't speak for other communities, but that amalgamation of voices and lived experience and ideas is so crucial. But I think my approach and my desire to learn more languages, and I think if I could have any wish from a proverbial genie, it would be able to speak all languages, including sign languages, which I'm beginning to learn. But I think that breadth of understanding of linguistic and cultural expertise gives us great nuance in understanding people, because I think the inherent opportunity but also challenge in this work of social justice is that we are working with people who are nuanced and diverse and unpredictable. And language gives us a gateway into speaking to people where they're at and amplifying those voices.
Thank you. Another question. What made you want to become a teacher?
Gosh, I remember my first day of school, and I remember my teacher pointing to me and saying, do you want to introduce yourself to the class? And I remember taking that opportunity and saying, hi, my name is Sinead. I have achondroplasia. That's achondroplasia, and I am 4 years old. I'm going to give Rachel just a moment to sign that very long word. But I remember school being a safe place for me. I remember my teachers asking me in those early days what it was that I wanted to be. And I don't know if it was their kindness or their respect or their broad understanding of equity, but I just felt like anything was possible in school. Whether that was going to the play area and putting on a medical and lab jacket and pretending to be a doctor, I just the experience that I had in school of being able to be myself, defined by my disability, with the accommodations inbuilt to give me the greatest opportunity of success, and not success in terms of academic attainment and in terms of achieving A's, but success in terms of being able to build friendships and relationships with my peers, success in terms of being able to, I don't know, even access PE in a way where I was the referee and everybody else got to participate in a way that was more accessible to them. I wasn't able to have the language to frame how that made me feel, but had a real sense of being included and the ability to be able to do that to others. Understanding how much that meant to me, I think, was probably the underlying rationale in me wanting to be a teacher, because I grew up in a really exceptional family unit who taught me that anything was possible. And my time in the classroom has taught me that not everybody gets that experience. And for me to be able to be that adult who tells a child that they are good enough as they are, that they shouldn't have to change who they are in order to fit in with the world, that we should redesign the world to fit with everyone else, the ability to be that voice for them and to encourage them to fulfill their own dreams and to be wildly ambitious about what might be possible, whether that's changing the Irish language or working in fashion or going to the moon or being a parent. It was a gift that I couldn't say no to, and it just felt so joyous to be able to receive that from somebody else, that the idea that I could be that facilitator for somebody else was just magic.
Sinead, continuing with the theme of teaching and your role as an educator, I wonder, when we were listening to your innovative approach to the classroom, empowering children to be curators of their own artwork, you described the limitations that some fellow students on your course imagined that you would experience as a teacher. And I wonder whether you and others have flipped the classroom so that school pupils are educating training teachers and education students on how pupils make the classroom accessible to teachers with disabilities.
I think absolutely. I began and then put on pause some research on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, looking at explicitly Article 12, which gives children a right to have a say about matters which affect them and the voice of the child. And I think that was never language that I had growing up and being a student myself. But then realizing that school is such a haven for co-design and collaboration. And I think for me, I never saw myself in terms of my role as a teacher as looking at it from John Locke's version of a tabula rasa, where I was going in to fill these empty vessels full of insight and education and information, but it would be a partnership, and it would be about a shared learning experience where children were coming to the classroom with such a wealth of information and knowledge, which may not have been in the curriculum, but was such a vehicle to create broader understanding about the world around us. And I think my understanding of disability was such an accelerator for that. I would love to see more of that. I would love to see greater research being undertaken as regards to that process of co-collaboration and co-design, but also what space is there for particularly disabled students, be that students with intellectual disabilities, students with physical and visible or invisible disabilities. What space can we create in classrooms where we can almost use the notion of mantle of the expert, where children assume the expertise that they have within themselves to be educators of the broader classroom. And that can happen in small ways. I remember teaching about the city of Dublin and the architecture of Dublin and showing some imagery of Central Bank in Dublin, which has no windows. And I remember asking the boys why they imagined that would be. And one of the boys putting up their hand, and he often, again, wouldn't be one of those students who would raise their hand quite easily. And he said, oh, well, it's because of the glass tax. He said in the era in which that building was built, there was a tax on glass. So to avoid spending the money, the banks just sealed up the windows. And the boys turned around and looked at him and said, how did you know that? And he said, oh, it was just something that I heard at home. How do we create space where I think teachers are not always the experts, but the facilitation for the lived experience that exists within a room? And that creates such a brilliant way in which to talk about identity, because our classrooms are becoming much more diverse than our teaching force at an accelerating rate. And how do we create space where children can be themselves and, again, don't have to code switch between home and school?
Thank you. I have a question relating to broader areas of EDI, and one of the audience have asked, have you found gender bias affects how people engage with and respond to disabled people?
think that's an excellent question. I have some sense of this in that my father is a little person much like me. And it's often fascinating to observe the differences in how other people approach us, based on us both having the same disability, but differing in age and in gender. And I think often the approach that my dad would receive from strangers is humorous. They would point, stare, and laugh. But there would always be more gendered discrimination in how strangers would experience me. Yes, they will point, stare, and laugh, but they will often talk about me in such challenging language that is about whether or not I'm fit to date them, whether or not relationships would be possible due to me being a woman and them being a man. It's much more sexualized, often rooted in that kind of discrimination that exists. And I think as we look through the intersections of society and being so conscious again that disability isn't just something that we must talk about through a white lens or through a gendered lens, but that multiple identities piece is so important to our intrinsic strategic development of this work that we begin to measure into the experiences that different people have as they are disabled, women, or queer, what it might be. But yes, I think there has also been advantages too, in the sense that when I used to speak with my dad growing up, I often thought that he would be my savior when it came to fashion, because he would understand as another little person what it was like to have to buy clothes. My dad would say to me, as in his experience, he would be able to just fit in with the norm. He would be able to buy tracksuit bottoms and a t-shirt, and he would be able to get about in day-to-day life, not having to think about the inaccessibility of clothes. In some ways, it gave me the engine that I needed in order to think about the fashion industry and disability and how to create space within fashion, to think about adaptive clothes, to think about innovative design through a lens of disability. I think if I didn't have the experience of my dad there, perhaps it wouldn't have dawned on me that this was a greater issue, and has been not that fashion is a particularly feminized industry, but has been a mobilizer for my journey in advocacy.
You've referenced fashion, and we do have a question that came in earlier on, and it's probably a short question, but really interesting. Who is your style icon?
Gosh, I think I'm still not sure. I grew up with this understanding that what I wanted to wear and what I could wear were two very different concepts, particularly in terms of when I would go shopping. So much of what was available to me was either inalterable, or I would have to go to the children's department, and what was available in the children's department felt infantilizing because so much of it was t-shirts with slogans like Daddy Little Princess, which may be fine for a 6-year-old, but not so professional for me to wear into a lecture or a session with a client. And I think realizing that space between the two has helped me to begin to understand that I use clothes as armor, that I use clothes as a vehicle to explain who I am to the world around me in a way in which so often people assume or guess, based on my physical disability, who I am and what I mean. So I think my fashion icon are people like Kate Blanchett, who has complete bravery in wearing a full caped outfit to the supermarket, or somebody like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who will go to the US Senate wearing a bag by Telfar, known commonly as the Bushwick Birkin, and it is a symbol of her support of designers who haven't always been included in the fashion system. So Telfar is a young Black queer designer, and by amplifying his work, create space for broader cultural conversations in an industry that has thrived on exclusivity. I think I also admire people like my mother, who has had this capsule wardrobe of pieces that she has kind of worn forever. I look through her wardrobe and it is slim in terms of the number of pieces, and she has items that she wore to her 21st birthday that she still wears today by throwing a different kind of jacket on it or by wearing different shoes. My mother thinks about fashion not something that is trend led or something that is fashion focused in terms of the system, but it's about functionality and what she feels comfortable in. She taught me that we shouldn't make clothes fit us. We should just fit into whatever clothes works for us. So I think there's people who understand the drama, the culture, and the sustainability and longevity of fashion are people that I subscribe to, but it ebbs and flows, much like what it is that I choose to wear.
Thank you. Another question. Can you talk about why you have described being comfortable in the company of LGBT plus people?
I remember a part of my university experience was in social clubs and nightclubs. And I remember going with my friends and it becoming really clear really quickly that other people, they just wanted to make that experience uncomfortable for me. I would have moments where usually young men would come over, they would pick me up, they would lift me into the air and throw me into the air, not knowing me, having never met me, or they would stand in front of me and be crude and rude because it gave them currency with their peer group and with their friends because it was humorous or funny, and all it did was make me feel unsafe. It made me not want to be in those social situations. And I began to refuse the invitations to go out at the weekends and at various different nights. And really, in some ways, minimize the relationships that I was able to have with my peers. But I remember one night someone suggested going to a place called the George in Dublin, which is a well-known, brilliant LGBTQ club. I remember watching the drag queens do amazing performances. And as the show ended, Madonna's Vogue began to play. And I thought, I really want to get up and dance to this. I know the lyrics, I know the choreography, I really want to do this, but I'll be honest, I was really worried. I was worried how others would react to me. I was worried that I would spend my whole time observing about who was trying to make fun, who was trying to make me uncomfortable. And I just said, you know what? I'm just going to do it. So I got up on the dance floor with my friends, and gosh, I just had the greatest time. Nobody was looking at me because in that space, everybody understood tangibly what it felt like to be different, what it felt like to be observed, what it felt like to be policed and to be constantly trying to portray a part of yourself so that you would fit in. I felt safe, really, is how I felt. And I remember thinking, I now get it. I understand why you want to go to nightclubs. I understand the music, the partying. It makes sense. And I began to go to those spaces more. In Ireland, for many years, there was a competition called Alternative Miss Ireland, which is a pageant-style performance competition to raise funds for HIV and AIDS charities. It was a performance that you would undertake for about 7 minutes on the Olympia Theatre stage, which has an audience of about 1,600 people. As a way to thank the queer community for their acceptance of me and their welcome of people like me, I entered this competition and told the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, where I was Snow White and my 7 dwarfs were very, very tall. It opened on the Olympia stage with me standing on a 4-foot platform wearing a 7-foot skirt with a narration that said, once upon a time in a land far away lived a little girl who actually isn't gay. But why did she enter? I hear you all say. Was she alternative? Why, yes, she was born this way. Lady Gaga's Born This Way started. The 7 tall dwarfs came out onto stage. They ripped my skirt and lifted me down, and it was magic. We did full choreography to pop songs, and my mother came out on stage dressed as the Wicked Queen to Nina Simone's I Put a Spell on You. She gave me an apple and I died dramatically. The 7 dwarfs around me. The second half opened with me in my prom and my Deb's dress in a glass coffin. My father, a little person, came out dressed as Prince Charming to Snow White's thematic music. He kissed my hand. I woke up. He sang One Direction's What Makes You Beautiful. I sang Rihanna's We Found Love. And we ended it with the Black Eyed Peas, I Got a Feeling. It was probably the most magical night of my life. And it ended up being that I won. And I am the alternative Miss Ireland Emeritus. And my speech that night on stage was just thanking the queer community for allowing different narratives to be told, for giving people space to be who they are and to feel safe within whatever identity they subscribe to. And I am so grateful for their friendship and their allyship and that understanding that we all need places just to be ourselves. And yeah, I am very much looking forward to when the pandemic eases, when we all feel safer and perhaps the vaccination is more readily available, that we can begin to congregate in those communities and in those hubs again, because I think they're really missed. And that sense of being part of something that's bigger than you, there's such a longing and a desire for. I'm excited to dance to Madonna's Vogue once again very soon.
Sinead, thank you for that fascinating and inspiring reference to when we all get together again and we can socialise and dance and looking forward to living our lives with absolute joy. We have a question someone's asked in relation to what has your experience been in relation to employment, and what advice would you have for employers like Queen's?
I think this is such a great question. I think there is lots of different approaches that can be taken. I think one of the first steps that you can take is, kind of as was mentioned earlier, is that in your application, in the details that you're providing to potential people who will apply, be really explicit and specific about either the accommodations that are available and can be requested, or asking a question for people to say, what accommodations do you need? That hints to an invitation that disabled people are welcome to apply, that it is not a burden for me to ask for a footstool or for somebody to ask for a sign language interpreter. It's not considered an additional cost, but a part of the wealth of diversity that is welcomed in a place like Queen's. I then think it's about enforcing those different types of accommodations that are available. I think it's also about clearly indicating where possible the salary that is available for a role like that, because so many disabled people have enormous healthcare costs, where they are trying to come out of a system that just often is challenging by the need for benefits and medical care. So often what happens is that in order to attain free medical care, thinking outside of the NHS wonderful system, is that often you're only able to work a specific number of hours in order to keep your financial benefits. And that means that if there is not a high enough salary in order for you to exit out of that system, you won't be able to apply. So being transparent on that information will again require people to not have to ask those questions, to not feel vulnerable, which will encourage them to actually apply and make an entry. I think it's also about when you're looking through CVs that you're not looking at it through a typical fashion of thinking, gosh, that person has a period of 3 months where they weren't employed. Out they go from the application pile. Pause. Ask questions. Perhaps they were unwell. Perhaps there was a family challenge. Perhaps they just weren't able to gain employment. I think our measures of success or our measures of the possibility of hiring somebody need to change, because we will only continue to hire the same types of people if we're only continuing to use the same system. I think, again, it's also about then taking an approach then after you begin looking at the way in which you hire people and begin to use more inclusive and accessible language and an approach to do so, that you then don't just use your same channels of communication in order to find those people. Because often then what companies will say and what institutions will say is, well, we've asked and we can't find anything. Have you begun to build relationships with the disabled people organisations and the community groups that exist within your area? Have you spoken to Dwarf Sports Association Northern Ireland and saying, hi, we have 2 posts currently available in Queen's. We would love if you could distribute this information to your membership and see if they might want to apply. That might not be a natural thinking or starting point for you. And the first time that you do that, those members may not apply because they may be weary of being used for tokenism or for marketing purposes, which is not your intent, but has been the way in which things have been done in the past. Build those relationships over time. Systemic change requires patience and tenacity. And as you begin to build those networks, what you will see is people looking at Queen's as a trusted place of employment for disabled people. And then I think it's about building long-term relationships, looking at the possibility of your students turning into employees. Do you measure the data of the disabled employees that you already have and the disabled students that you have? I imagine you do that for services and assistive technologies and for various different resources that you have. But how can you also create a culture of transparency where it's not just about disabled people being asked and requested how they identify, but beginning to realize that disability is broad and that anybody who experiences anxiety or depression is a welcome and valid member of the disabled community? How do we build this culture of pride over something that has historically been stigmatized? I think it's also then thinking about, is there a way in which that doesn't feel disenfranchising to others, that you begin to create quotas in the same way that people have done about gender, about disability? Because whilst we have great intent to create change and whilst creating metrics like quotas are not a way in which we'd like to create progress, unfortunately, if we wait for things to happen naturally, I will be retired, as I imagine many people on this call will be. So is there things that we can indicate now to bring about change sooner that will cultivate a whole new culture at Queen's, which I think you're ready for and already actively doing from the number of brilliant policies that you have initiated. But how do we just accelerate that and keep going, particularly as we move into hopefully what next year is a period of normality, whatever normality is? How do we ensure that the work that we're thinking about as regards to inclusion and equity isn't just something that we do when we have more time during a pandemic, but this is just the way we work. We work with purpose and we're thinking about all people forevermore.
Sinead, the audience are really appreciating both your talk and the discussion afterwards and the questions, and we can see that coming in through the chat. I wonder if we can give you one last question from the audience, and it's one that you have probably been asked many times before, but what would you tell your younger self?
Gosh, I remember going to a school, and I tried to visit schools as often as possible when it was and is safe to do so. And I remember leaving a large hall of secondary school students, and there must have been 1,000 students in them. And I was leaving the building, and a student ran out of the hall, and she came up to me and she said, "Can I ask you a question?" Lots of the teachers were like, "She has to go, she's busy, she's leaving." I said, "Sure, of course. You'll sit and I'll stay standing and we'll be at eye level." I said, "What's your question?" She said, "How do you keep going?" I didn't really know what she meant. I had a sense, but I wasn't sure. And I said, "Would you be able to explain that a bit more?" And she said, "There are just some days when I find it really hard to keep going. How do you?" And I realized that what she was asking me was something far broader and far more important. And I felt so honored that she trusted me with such a question, because I realized that even though the question was for me, it reflected more about her and her experience. And I said, there are some days when it's easy and it's great and I don't think about it. I said, and there are some days that are really challenging. And I tried to give myself a monologue of, if yesterday was okay, today is most likely okay, as will tomorrow be. And then some days when a day is too long of a period of time to think about, I think about the morning. This morning was fine. Tomorrow morning is going to be great. Or this afternoon is going to be great. And sometimes you need to take it hour by hour and day by day. I said, but you need to remember that you're just enough as you are. That you are changing the world by just being in it. That the world would be less without you. That there would be a void. Even if there isn't one that you are able to measure right now, it would be less without you. I think about that moment so often. I have no idea if those words helped or hindered or were support to that young woman, but I think about it in my most challenging moment. But I think if I could go back to my youngest self and talk to her, I think it's something that I still need to be told now, even at 30, on days, even like today, where the voice in my head is telling me this isn't interesting to Queen's University Belfast. They do not want to hear about takeaway menus and setting the table, and you really should tell more important stories. And why didn't they ask an actual academic with real prestigious background and multiple letters before and after their name to give this talk? I think often we say things to ourselves that we would never dare say to our friends or to our family members or to even the people we dislike. I think the world gives us permission to think less of ourselves. It encourages us to do so. And I think I would tell my younger self, and I think this is maybe particularly gendered, to not listen to the voice in your head, to deprogram it, to give yourself a new monologue, to believe that you can do it until it's evident that you're going to find it challenging. And even then, there'll be ways in which to get support and to help and to find solutions. But I think we talk ourselves out of so much of our ambitions because the voice in our head tells us to do so. And I think I would request that, I just wouldn't listen to it. And I would build, one of the things that I have now is that I've asked kind of 6 people in my life to be voluntary boards of advisors to me and my consciousness. And whenever I'm starting a new project or worried about giving a lecture at Queen's University, I come to them. And I say, what do you think? Is this something I'm able for? Do you think, how does the speech read? Is it interesting? And they are the people that I rely on for criticism and feedback and celebration. And I think if we all had those people that we could trust in, which may be one person, which may be 3, which may be 15, to build us up and to give us a sense of reality too, we'd all be in better shape rather than listening to the voice that tells us you're never good enough.
Sinead, thank you so much for addressing that last question. And in fact, the last 60 minutes have been inspiring. That's a word that's come up so often in the chat. Educational, motivating. And we thank you for joining us. And we thank the audience also for participating today, for asking the questions, and for making this event a collective experience in spite of the pandemic situation that we find ourselves in. We have been reminded that the world in which we live is not yet inclusive of everyone. Walking through an airport with Sinead, or standing with her in that supermarket queue that she's talked about here and also in her TED Talk. It seems unbelievable that none of us have made those environments genuinely inclusive and accessible. Thinking of experience of public bathrooms and how Sinead has described this, and design that should be enabling the right to dignity and health. It's unfair and unacceptable, and Sinead has challenged us to do something about it. And we've learned the barriers to inclusion, both physical and invisible. They need to be highlighted and they need to be removed. Sinead's story has resonated with members of this call and the audience in many, many different ways. Those of us with invisible or visible disabilities, those of us who have people in our lives with disabilities, will have identified areas in our own experience which have aligned with what we've heard today. We all need to tilt the lens and use our agency to advocate for people who are not included in whatever situation. And then we need to act and make a difference. On Sinead's website, she says, I've been very fortunate to visit schools, workplaces, government agencies, and the White House to facilitate honest conversations about education, disability, fashion, and accessibility. I make every attempt to advocate for the inclusion of all, to amplify the voices who are often not considered, and challenge officials to legislate with the most marginalised members in our communities. And Sinead, we thank you for your honesty and for sharing from your personal experience. That experience has encompassed you being loved, having joy, addressing challenges, demonstrating resilience, your altruistic advocacy, and outstanding leadership. When you and I had that virtual walk together earlier this year, I felt in some ways I knew you. And I think I speak for the audience who now feel that they have met you and they've really enjoyed an inspiring conversation over lunch. Next time, when the hope of the COVID-19 vaccines make our world a safer place, we look forward to welcoming you to Queen's in person with a real lunch and to walking across campus and hearing what has happened next for you and your vision for accessibility and inclusion. Thank you, Sinead, and thank you everyone for participating today.